Leaders, a very important part of the whole section of line, from your backing through your fly line to the leader. It's the thing that presents the fly to the fish, and it needs to be presented in a natural way so that the fish thinks it's something it wants to eat. I've got two leaders here, a fairly standard saltwater leader, which can also be used in heavy freshwater situations, and a typical commercially tapered leader, which you normally tie your tippet or the end section onto, and it's used for trout or lighter saltwater fishing. But I'll start up here with the saltwater leader. We normally have a surgeon's knot at one end so that we can do a loop-to-loop connection to our fly line. Normally about 4 to 4.5 feet of butt section. I've got 40 pound here going through to a 30 pound section, going through to a 20 pound section, which is what I use a lot where I fish here on the flats. That can be varied. It could be a 35 pound section for your butt section, a 25 pound section here, and a 15 pound section if you're fishing for smaller fish or in situations where the fish are quite spooky. If they haven't got teeth and you don't need a bite tippet, which I'll get into a bit later, then that is a fairly typical standard leader. The main reason leaders are tapered is so the line rolls out better and presents the fly better, and also you usually get a more accurate cast if your leader is tapered rather than a big heavy butt section with no taper in it. A lot of people with saltwater and heavy freshwater just use a heavy butt section and maybe another section like 40 pound and 30 pound, tie their fly on there. But the other reason you have a leader tapered like this is that if anything breaks or lets you down in the whole system from your backing right through the fly line's an expensive thing. You don't want to have to replace it. You don't want to have to replace your backing either. So what you want to break, it's like a fuse or a circuit breaker, is this end tippet. That's what you want to break. If something is going to break, that's where you want it to break. You may not have a spare fly line. You don't want to have to go through tying all the knots, setting the whole thing up again. If anything does break, it's this end, the tippet, that you want to break. So that's your fuse or your circuit breaker. I use two different types of material on my saltwater leaders and my heavy freshwater leaders. I use fluorocarbon sometimes, but most of the time I just use monofilament, standard monofilament, a heavy butt section, slightly lighter midsection, going through to the lighter section at the very end. The times that I use fluorocarbon is if I want the fly to get down quickly. That's the main thing I use fluorocarbon for. If you're fishing surface flies, you're much better off using standard monofilament because it does sink much more slowly. Fluorocarbon does sink quickly. So here we have a commercial tapered leader. There are no knots in it apart from the loop at the end of the butt section and where you tie your knot to the tippet at the other end. What you do if you do use a tapered leader, and many trout fishermen do, if I'm fishing for trout, I use a commercially tapered leader, is you just tie your final tippet section onto the end of that tapered leader, which is usually around 9 feet, 10 feet in length. And that way you're not constantly cutting back into your tapered leader. It will last much longer if you do it that way, and you just tie your own section. If you're fishing for trout, for instance, you may have a 4 or 6 pound tippet on the end here attached with a blood knot, and once you start cutting back into that, you can easily just snip it off and put another couple of feet of tippet on there, so you're not constantly cutting back into your main tapered leader. It will last longer, and it's more cost effective if you do it that way. As far as knots go, you've got, normally I tie a surgeon's loop in the end here. Sometimes I'll tie a bimini. I will get into more knots later on in the course. So normally it's just a loop knot to attach it, loop to loop connection to your fly line, a blood knot attaching your 40 pound to your 30 pound. They're fairly similar breaking strains, so a blood knot is a good knot to use. Another blood knot here, because again they're fairly similar breaking strains, even though it goes from 40 to 30 to 20, a blood knot is a good knot to use in that situation. And then finally, you've got a loop knot of some kind. I use a lefty's loop knot to attach my fly, or a uni knot, depending on whether you want a loop in your fly. So we've had a look at a couple of basic leaders there. Don't underestimate leaders. They're a very important part of fly fishing.